This topic is heavy, it's unsettling, it offers no comfortable answers, but it confronts everything you've believed so far. So don't rush, just stay. And listen, human history is not only a story of oppression, it is also a story of participation. People have not always been forced into harmful systems. Sometimes they defended them. This idea is uncomfortable because we prefer to see ourselves as victims rather than contributors. Yet history whispers a darker truth. When a system causes harm, why do people protect it instead of dismantling it? Why do the hungry defend the rules that starve them? Why do the unfree fear freedom itself? These are not easy questions because the answers are not simple. Humans do not always wear chains because they are forced to. Sometimes they give those chains meaning. They call them security, order, tradition, destiny, or simply say, there is no alternative. And in that moment, the chain stops looking like a chain. It becomes comfort. History shows that even the most brutal systems did not survive by force alone. They survived through consent. People said, yes, it is hard, but it is necessary. Yes, it is unfair, but it keeps us safe. Yes, it hurts, but it gives stability. And stability has often been more seductive than freedom, because freedom demands responsibility, choice, and doubt. Doubt creates fear. This video is not here to accuse you. It is not here to judge. This video is a mirror. And in that mirror, we see a difficult truth. People sometimes defend the systems that harm them because those systems relieve them of the burden of thinking. Questioning is painful. Obedience is easy, and that ease always comes at a price. This video is about that price. It is about the moment when a human being stops being only a victim of oppression and becomes its guardian. If these questions unsettle you, this video is for you. If you are looking for comfort, you may want to leave. But if you are willing to understand, stay. Because the most dangerous systems are not always the ones that hurt us. The most dangerous systems are the ones we protect. Human beings often describe themselves as rational, independent thinkers, but history repeatedly proves that this self-image is fragile. At the psychological core of the human mind lies not logic, but the desire for safety and certainty. The brain evolved not to seek truth, but to avoid danger, and uncertainty is interpreted as danger long before it is evaluated as possibility. When outcomes are unclear, the nervous system reacts with anxiety, and anxiety demands immediate relief. This is why clear narratives, strict rules, and authoritative systems feel comforting even when they cause harm. A harmful system does not need to be just, it only needs to feel predictable. Predictability lowers stress, and lowered stress feels like survival. This is one of the deepest psychological weaknesses of the human condition. People are not drawn to systems because they are good. They are drawn to them because they reduce mental effort. To question a system requires sustained attention, emotional resilience, and the willingness to live without guaranteed answers. Most people are capable of intelligence, but few are comfortable with uncertainty. Doubt creates internal tension. That tension feels like instability, and instability triggers fear. When fear rises, the mind does not search for truth, it searches for closure. Harmful systems understand this. They offer simple explanations for complex realities. They replace uncertainty with slogans, nuance with binaries, and questions with obedience. Once the world is divided into clear categories, right and wrong, us and them, order and chaos, the psychological burden on the individual disappears. The system absorbs responsibility. Choice is replaced by instruction. Moral ambiguity is replaced by duty. In this state, the individual no longer experiences themselves as an agent, but as a function, and functions do not question their purpose. Another psychological vulnerability lies in social belonging. Humans are deeply social organisms. Exclusion once meant death, and the brain still carries that ancient fear. To question a dominant system risks isolation, judgment, and loss of identity. So the mind often chooses belonging over truth. Defending the system becomes a way to defend one's place within the group. Cognitive dissonance strengthens this attachment. When people suffer under a system they support, the mind faces a painful contradiction. To resolve it, most do not abandon the system, they justify it. Suffering is reframed as necessary. Sacrifice becomes virtue, pain becomes proof of loyalty. In this way, the system no longer appears as an external force. It becomes part of the self. Attacking it would feel like self-destruction. This is why psychological weakness should not be confused with stupidity. It is not ignorance that binds people to harmful systems. It is fear, exhaustion, and the longing for mental rest. Obedience offers relief from decision-making. Relief feels like peace, and peace is seductive even when it is built on quiet harm. The human mind often prefers a false sense of control to the responsibility of freedom, and until this weakness is recognized, systems that exploit it will continue to thrive, not through violence alone, but through the silent cooperation of those they harm. Are you defending a system because it is right or because it feels familiar? If this system disappeared tomorrow, would you feel free or would you feel lost? Do you believe what you believe because you questioned it or because it was given to you early? When was the last time you doubted something that made you feel safe? If uncertainty scares you, is it really truth you are searching for? Would you rather live with a painful truth or a comforting explanation? Are you obeying because you agree or because disobedience feels exhausting? If questioning costs you belonging, would you still question? Is your loyalty a choice or a psychological reflex? When suffering is explained as necessary, do you feel meaning or relief from thinking? If this system truly served you, would it need your constant defense? Are your beliefs protecting you or protecting the structure around you? At what point does stability become a cage? If freedom demands responsibility, are you willing to pay that price? And finally, if this system harms you, why does defending it feel safer than imagining life without it? Fear is one of the most powerful forces shaping human behavior because it does not ask for permission. It reacts. The human mind evolved to prioritize survival over truth and safety over meaning. When fear enters the picture, reason quietly steps aside. What matters is not what is right, but what feels stable. This is where harmful systems gain their strength. They do not present themselves as good, they present themselves as necessary. They tell people that without them, there would be chaos, violence, collapse. They frame fear as protection and control as care. In this psychological environment, security becomes more valuable than freedom, even when that security is artificial. False stability is especially seductive because it mimics peace. It offers routines, rules, and predictability. It tells people where they belong and what is expected of them. This removes the burden of constant decision-making, and the human mind loves relief. Any system that promises to reduce fear instantly gains legitimacy, even if it is the source of that fear itself. This is the paradox of control. The system creates anxiety and then sells protection from it. People accept restrictions not because they are convinced, but because they are afraid of what might happen without them. Unknown futures feel more dangerous than known suffering, so individuals cling to familiar pain rather than risk unfamiliar freedom. The idea of collapse is terrifying, so even deeply flawed systems are defended as lesser evils. Fear also narrows perception. When people feel threatened, they stop asking complex questions. They seek simple explanations and clear enemies. This makes them vulnerable to narratives that divide the world into order and chaos, good and evil, inside and outside. Any challenge to the system is framed as a threat to safety. Critics are labeled reckless, dangerous, or irresponsible. In this way, fear polices thought more effectively than force ever could. SAFTA stability depends on repetition. The same messages repeated over time become truth through familiarity. People begin to associate obedience with calm and resistance with danger. Eventually, the body reacts before the mind does. The feeling of safety becomes tied to compliance, and once safety is internalized this way, breaking away feels like stepping into darkness. This is why fear-based systems rarely collapse overnight. They persist because they live inside people. They condition individuals to equate control with survival and uncertainty with death. As long as fear defines safety and safety defines morality, people will continue to protect systems that harm them, not because they are blind, but because they are scared. And fear, when left unexamined, can make even chains feel like shelter. Throughout history, harmful systems rarely survived by force alone. They endured because people remained loyal to them, even when those systems caused suffering. This loyalty did not come from ignorance, but from psychological, emotional, and social pressures that shaped human behavior across centuries. Enslaved populations defended empires that exploited them. Soldiers died for rulers who saw them as expendable. Citizens praised regimes that restricted their freedom because those regimes promised order, identity, and meaning. Loyalty to harmful systems often grew strongest where suffering was normalized. When pain becomes routine, it stops being questioned. People adapt to injustice the same way they adapt to climate or terrain. It becomes part of life, and challenging it feels unnatural. In many empires, from ancient civilizations to modern states, the system presented itself as eternal. To oppose it was to oppose reality itself. This illusion of inevitability discouraged resistance before it even began. History shows that rulers understood this well. They wrapped power in sacred language, divine authority, national destiny, or historical necessity. By doing so, they transformed obedience into virtue and doubt into sin. People were not only expected to comply, they were expected to believe. That belief created emotional investment. Once someone sacrificed for a system, questioning it became psychologically painful. To admit the system was wrong would mean admitting one's own suffering was meaningless. So loyalty deepened not despite the harm, but because of it. This is why oppressive systems often inspire fierce devotion. The more people give up, the more they need the system to be justified. Harm becomes proof of commitment rather than evidence of injustice. History also shows how dissenters were isolated long before they were punished. By labeling critics as traitors, heretics, or destabilizers, the system turned loyalty into a moral boundary. Those inside felt righteous, those outside felt dangerous. This division protected the system from internal collapse. Over time, people learned to police each other. They defended the system in conversations, traditions, and daily rituals, even without direct orders. At that point, the system no longer needed constant violence. It lived through habit, belief, and fear of exclusion. This pattern repeats across eras because it aligns with deep human instincts. The need to belong, the fear of chaos, and the desire for meaning all push individuals toward loyalty, even when loyalty causes harm. History is filled with moments where people stood on the wrong side of justice while believing they were preserving order. These moments remind us that harmful systems are rarely maintained by villains alone. They are sustained by ordinary people, choosing familiarity over uncertainty, identity over truth, and stability over freedom. Belief is rarely just an idea. It is a foundation for identity. When a system succeeds in turning belief into belonging, it becomes deeply resistant to challenge. People do not simply follow the system, they become part of it. And once identity is fused with structure, questioning the system feels like questioning the self. This is the trap of belief. identity and belonging. Humans are social beings. Long before laws or institutions, belonging meant survival. To be accepted by the group was to be protected. To be excluded was to be vulnerable. This ancient instinct still governs modern behavior. When a system offers identity, it offers safety. People are no longer just individuals. They are members, believers, loyal citizens. This sense of belonging fills emotional gaps. It provides purpose, status, and direction. But it also creates psychological dependency. Once identity is tied to the system, defending it becomes a personal necessity. Criticism feels like an attack, not on ideas, but on existence. People respond emotionally rather than rationally, because what is at stake is not logic, but self-worth. Belief systems reinforce this trap by defining who is inside and who is outside. Those inside are moral, reasonable, and deserving. Those outside are misguided, dangerous, or corrupt. This division strengthens loyalty and discourages doubt. Doubt risks social death. When belonging depends on agreement, truth becomes secondary to acceptance. People silence their questions not because they lack them, but because asking them threatens connection. Over time, the system no longer needs to enforce belief. The community does it instead. Language, rituals, and shared narratives constantly remind individuals who they are supposed to be. Identity becomes a script, and deviation feels like betrayal. The deeper the emotional investment, the harder it becomes to step back. Admitting error would mean losing not just beliefs, but relationships, history, and meaning. This is why people cling to systems that harm them, because leaving would require rebuilding the self from nothing. In this way, belief becomes a cage without visible bars. It feels warm, it feels familiar, but it limits growth. As long as identity depends on obedience and belonging depends on silence, harmful systems remain protected, not by force but by the human need to belong. In the modern world, control rarely arrives with chains or soldiers. It arrives quietly, wrapped in convenience, comfort, and choice. People are no longer forced to obey, they are persuaded to participate. This is the nature of voluntary servitude. The systems that govern modern life do not demand submission. They offer ease. They promise efficiency, connection, and security. In exchange, they ask for attention, data, time, and silence. The transaction feels harmless because it feels optional. But over time, what begins as choice hardens into dependence. Unlike historical oppression, modern control is subtle. It does not forbid, it nudges, it does not punish openly, it rewards selectively. Behavior is shaped not through fear of violence, but through fear of exclusion. Visibility becomes currency. Algorithms decide what is seen, what is amplified, and what disappears. People adapt their thoughts and expressions accordingly, not because they are ordered to, but because they want to remain visible. This is how control becomes internalized. The individual starts regulating themselves. Every click, like, and pause feeds a system that learns how to guide attention more precisely. The mind becomes predictable, and predictability is power. In this environment, freedom is redefined, not as the ability to choose differently, but as the ability to choose within approved boundaries. People feel free because they are constantly choosing, yet rarely questioning the framework of those choices. The illusion of autonomy is maintained through personalization. Everything feels tailored, yet everyone is guided in similar directions. This creates the paradox of modern servitude. People participate willingly in systems that exhaust them, shape their desires, and narrow their thinking. Work becomes identity, busy becomes virtue. Constant stimulation replaces reflection. Silence feels uncomfortable because silence breaks the spell. Voluntary servitude thrives because it does not feel like oppression. It feels like normal life. To resist it requires awareness, restraint, and the courage to step away. But stepping away means losing access, status, and belonging. So most people stay, they scroll, they comply, they adapt, and in doing so, they protect a system that does not need to dominate by force because it is carried forward by consent. The modern world does not imprison bodies, it occupies minds, and as long as control feels comfortable, chains remain invisible. Obedience offers comfort because it removes burden, the burden of thinking, the burden of choosing, the burden of responsibility. When a system tells people what is right, what is wrong, and what is expected, the mind relaxes. Decision-making is exhausting. Uncertainty drains energy. Obedience simplifies existence by outsourcing judgment to authority. In this way, submission is not always experienced as loss, it is experienced as relief. The individual no longer has to wrestle with moral ambiguity or personal doubt. They follow, they comply, and compliance brings psychological rest. This comfort is especially powerful in times of fear or instability. When the world feels unpredictable, obedience promises structure. Rules feel like shelter. Hierarchy feels like order. Even when the rules are harmful, they provide predictability, and predictability calms the nervous system. People begin to associate obedience with safety and disobedience with danger. Not necessarily physical danger, but social and psychological risk. To disobey is to stand alone. To obey is to belong. This association trains the mind to seek comfort over truth. Obedience also protects the ego. When outcomes are bad, the obedient individual can say they were only following instructions. Responsibility dissolves into procedure. Guilt is softened by duty. This is why harmful actions are often carried out by ordinary people who do not see themselves as cruel. They are not acting out of malice, but out of submission. Obedience creates distance between action and conscience. The system becomes the moral actor. The individual becomes a tool, and tools do not feel shame for how they are used. Over time, this dynamic reshapes identity. People begin to define themselves by their role rather than their values. They are good workers, good citizens, good believers, because goodness is measured by compliance. Once obedience is rewarded with approval, status, or security, it becomes self-reinforcing. Resistance, by contrast, feels uncomfortable. It brings anxiety, conflict, and isolation. So even when people sense that something is wrong, they suppress that feeling for the sake of inner peace. This is the quiet power of obedience. It does not need to threaten. It seduces. It promises calm in exchange for silence. And silence feels easier than confrontation. The comfort of obedience is dangerous because it feels harmless. It feels like rest. But beneath that rest is surrender, not just of action, but of awareness. When obedience becomes a habit, freedom begins to feel burdensome. Choice feels heavy. Independent thought feels risky. In this state, people do not need to be controlled. They control themselves. They adjust their behavior to fit expectations. They avoid questions that disturb their sense of calm, and they defend the system not because they believe in it deeply, but because obedience has become the source of their psychological comfort. This is how systems endure, not through constant force, but through the human desire to feel safe, to feel accepted, and to feel relieved from the weight of thinking for oneself. Awareness is not a gift without consequences. It comes with a cost that many people are unwilling to pay. To become aware is to lose innocence, comfort, and simplicity. Once you begin to see how systems operate, you can no longer unsee them. The world stops feeling neutral. Every rule, every norm, every expectation begins to carry weight. This constant perception is exhausting because awareness demands engagement. It demands that you notice contradictions, question assumptions, and live with unresolved tension. Unaware people rest more easily. They accept explanations without friction. They sleep inside narratives that protect them from discomfort. The aware mind does not rest so easily. It carries questions into silence. It feels the strain of seeing what others ignore. This creates isolation. When you see beyond a system, you often find yourself alone among those who still believe. Awareness separates. It marks you as different, critical, or dangerous. Not because you are aggressive, but because you disrupt shared illusions. Shared illusions are social glue, and those who threaten them risk exclusion. This is one of the heaviest costs of awareness. Loss of belonging. Furthermore, awareness removes the comfort of moral outsourcing. You can no longer say you did not know. You can no longer hide behind procedure or tradition. Responsibility becomes personal. Every choice feels heavier because it is fully owned. This weight leads many people to retreat back into ignorance, not because they are incapable of understanding, but because they are tired. Awareness also brings grief. You begin to mourn what you once believed. You grieve lost trust, lost certainty, and sometimes lost relationships. The world becomes more complex and less forgiving, yet despite its cost, awareness offers something obedience never can. It offers agency, the ability to choose consciously rather than reactively. It allows for integrity instead of comfort. And although awareness is painful, it is also liberating in a deeper sense. Not because it makes life easier, but because it makes life honest. The cost of awareness is high. It demands courage, endurance, and solitude. But without paying that cost, freedom remains an illusion, and systems that harm will continue to feel normal. The question is not whether awareness hurts. The question is whether the comfort of ignorance is worth the price of surrendering one's inner freedom. Rebellion often feels immoral, not because it is inherently wrong, but because morality itself is shaped by the systems it threatens. From early childhood, people learn that goodness is associated with obedience, politeness, and respect for authority. Rules are framed as protection, and breaking them is framed as danger. This conditioning runs deep. By the time someone considers rebellion, their sense of right and wrong has already been trained to associate order with virtue and disruption with harm. As a result, challenging a system triggers guilt before it triggers reason. The emotional response comes first, logic follows later. Harmful systems reinforce this by moralizing compliance. They present loyalty as responsibility and dissent as selfishness. Rebels are described as reckless, troublemakers, or enemies of stability. This framing makes rebellion feel like an attack on the community rather than a challenge to injustice. People fear that questioning the system will harm others, even when the system itself is causing harm. Morality becomes collective rather than reflective. What feels moral is what preserves cohesion, not what reveals truth. Another reason rebellion feels immoral is because it threatens identity. When someone rebels, they step outside shared values and narratives. This creates discomfort not only for the rebel, but for everyone watching. It forces others to confront doubts they would rather suppress. Condemning rebellion becomes a way to protect one's own sense of righteousness. If the rebel is immoral, then obedience remains good. This psychological defense keeps the moral order intact. Rebellion also exposes responsibility. If the system can be challenged, then continued compliance becomes a choice rather than a necessity. This realization is unsettling. It is easier to label rebellion as wrong than to accept complicity. In this way, morality becomes a shield against accountability. History shows that many actions now praised as courageous were once condemned as immoral. The discomfort was not about ethics, but about disruption. Rebellion breaks routines, questions sacred assumptions, and introduces uncertainty. And uncertainty feels dangerous to a mind trained to equate safety with order. So rebellion feels immoral because it violates emotional conditioning, threatens belonging, and exposes uncomfortable truths. not because it lacks moral value, but because it demands a re-evaluation of what morality truly serves. Collective silence is not the absence of voices. It is the presence of fear shared quietly. When many people see the same injustice but choose not to speak, the silence itself becomes a system. No one orders it, no one enforces it openly, yet it holds with remarkable strength. Each individual waits for someone else to speak first, and as everyone waits, the silence deepens. This is how harm becomes normalized, not through agreement but through hesitation. People convince themselves that if something were truly wrong, someone would say something. The absence of protest is mistaken for consent, and the system benefits from this illusion. Collective silence protects power by dissolving responsibility. When no single person feels accountable, everyone feels innocent. Each individual tells themselves their voice would not matter, that speaking would change nothing, that it is safer to stay quiet. This logic feels rational, but multiplied across a population, it becomes devastating. Silence spreads socially. It is learned by observation. When people see others remain quiet, they interpret it as wisdom, prudence, or acceptance. Speaking out begins to feel inappropriate, dramatic, or disruptive. The one who breaks the silence risks standing alone, and loneliness is a powerful deterrent, so silence becomes cooperation without intention. Harm continues not because people support it, but because they do not interrupt it. Over time, collective silence reshapes perception. What was once shocking becomes ordinary. What was once unacceptable becomes routine. Language adapts. Euphemisms replace truths. Suffering is softened by abstraction. The emotional impact fades, and once emotion fades, action rarely follows. This is why collective silence is more effective than censorship. Censorship fights resistance. Silence prevents it from forming at all. It trains people to internalize limits, to censor themselves before speaking, and eventually, people stop noticing the injustice altogether. Not because it disappeared, but because attention moved away. Collective silence is comfortable. It avoids conflict. It preserves social harmony on the surface. But beneath that calm lies complicity. History remembers moments when silence was louder than violence because it allowed violence to persist unnoticed. The danger of collective silence is not that people do not care. The danger is that caring becomes private while harm remains public. And as long as silence feels safer than speech, systems that harm will continue to operate undisturbed, carried forward by the quiet agreement of those who choose not to speak. The illusion of choice is one of the most effective tools of modern control. When people believe they are choosing freely, they rarely question the structure that limits those choices. Instead of being forced down a single path, individuals are offered multiple options that all lead in similar directions. This creates the feeling of autonomy without granting real power. The mind focuses on selecting between options, rather than asking who designed them and why. Choice becomes a distraction from agency. In many systems, freedom is defined as the ability to choose within predefined boundaries. People can choose what to consume, what to say, what to support, but only from what is made available. Options that challenge the foundation of the system are excluded long before a choice is presented. This makes control invisible because it operates before awareness. The person feels responsible for the outcome because they chose it, yet the framework itself remains untouched. This illusion is reinforced through personalization. Choices appear tailored to individual preferences, creating the sense that the system understands and serves the user. In reality, personalization narrows exposure. It filters information, reinforces existing beliefs, and reduces encounters with alternatives. The more personalized the experience, the more predictable behavior becomes, and predictability allows for subtle guidance. When choices feel familiar and comfortable, they are rarely questioned. Another layer of this illusion lies in consequence. If every choice leads to similar results, choice loses its meaning. People may feel active while remaining powerless. They select between brands, opinions, or identities, while the underlying conditions stay the same. This creates a cycle of engagement without change. Action replaces reflection. Participation replaces resistance. The illusion of choice also protects systems from blame. When outcomes are harmful, individuals are told they chose poorly. This shifts responsibility away from the structure and onto the person. Systemic issues become personal failures. In this way, choice becomes a moral burden rather than a liberating force. People blame themselves instead of questioning the system. The illusion of choice persists because it feels empowering. It satisfies the human need for control without requiring confrontation. But true freedom is not about choosing between given options. It is about the ability to question why those options exist at all. Until that question is asked, choice remains a performance, and control remains intact, hidden behind the comforting belief that we are free because we can choose. When identity becomes a prison, it no longer serves as a source of meaning, but as a mechanism of control. Identity is meant to help individuals understand who they are, but when it hardens, it begins to dictate who they are allowed to be. At that point, identity stops evolving and starts enforcing boundaries. People cling to labels, roles, and group definitions because they offer certainty. In a complex world, identity simplifies existence. It tells people where they belong, what they should believe, and how they should behave. But this simplicity comes at a cost. Once a person defines themselves primarily through a fixed identity, change feels like betrayal. Questioning beliefs feels like self-erasure. Growth feels dangerous because it threatens coherence. The system benefits from this rigidity. When identity aligns with ideology, profession, nation, or belief system, loyalty becomes automatic. Defending the system feels like defending the self. Criticism is no longer evaluated intellectually. It is experienced emotionally as an attack on dignity and worth. This emotional fusion makes dialogue nearly impossible because disagreement feels like violence. In this state, identity restricts perception. People selectively notice information that confirms who they think they are and ignore anything that challenges it. The mind becomes a guard protecting a narrative rather than a tool for understanding. Reinforcement comes from the group. Shared language, rituals, and values reward conformity and punish deviation. Subtle signals indicate what is acceptable to think and say. Over time, self-censorship replaces external control. The individual internalizes the rules of the identity prison. They no longer need to be reminded. They feel discomfort at the thought of stepping outside the role. When identity becomes a prison, freedom is reframed as threat. To leave the identity would mean losing community, status, and meaning. It would mean facing uncertainty alone. So people remain loyal even when the identity harms them, limits them, or contradicts their lived experience. The prison does not feel like a cage. It feels like home. This is why identity-based systems endure. They do not rely on force, they rely on attachment. As long as people believe they are their identity and not more than it, they will defend the walls that confine them. And the tragedy is not that identity exists, but that it is mistaken for the entirety of the self. When that happens, the path to freedom is not blocked by locks, but by fear of losing who one believes they are. Shame is one of the most effective instruments of social control because it works from the inside. Unlike fear, which threatens from the outside, shame reshapes how individuals see themselves. When shame is activated, people do not feel that they have done something wrong. They feel that they are something wrong. This distinction is crucial. Behavior can be changed through rules, but identity can be shaped through shame. Social systems understand this deeply. They embed expectations into norms, and when those norms are violated, shame enforces compliance without the need for punishment. People internalize the gaze of others. They imagine judgment even in silence. This imagined judgment becomes a constant regulator of behavior. Shame thrives in visibility. When societies establish standards of normality, success, morality, or loyalty, any deviation becomes a risk to social standing. People learn quickly which thoughts, questions, or behaviors lead to ridicule or exclusion. As a result, they begin to censor themselves. The most powerful aspect of shame is that it recruits the individual into their own surveillance. No authority needs to intervene. The person corrects themselves before conflict arises. This self-policing creates obedience that feels voluntary because it is experienced as personal responsibility rather than external pressure. Shame also binds groups together by creating insiders and outsiders. Those who conform feel morally superior. Those who do not are labeled irresponsible, immature, or dangerous. This moral framing disguises control as ethics. People believe they are enforcing values when in reality they are enforcing boundaries. Shame makes resistance psychologically costly. To challenge the system is not just to risk punishment, but to risk humiliation. The fear of being seen as foolish, ungrateful, or immoral silences dissent more effectively than threats ever could. Over time, shame reshapes identity. People align themselves with approved narratives to avoid inner discomfort. They adopt language, opinions, and attitudes, not because they are convinced, but because deviation feels unbearable. This is how shame stabilizes harmful systems. It turns social pressure into self-discipline. And because shame feels personal, its political function often goes unnoticed. As long as individuals blame themselves for not fitting in, rather than questioning the norms themselves, systems remain protected. Shame does not need force. It needs agreement, and once shame is internalized, control becomes invisible, operating quietly through the desire to be accepted and the fear of being cast out. Education is often presented as a path to knowledge, freedom, and critical thinking, but in many systems it functions primarily as conditioning rather than enlightenment. From an early age, education teaches not only what to think, but how to think, and more importantly, when not to question. Children learn schedules, authority, assessment, and obedience long before they learn understanding. Success is measured through compliance with predefined standards, not through depth of insight or originality of thought. This trains the mind to associate correctness with approval and curiosity with risk. Questions that fit the framework are rewarded. Questions that challenge it are discouraged, ignored, or subtly punished. Over time, this shapes behavior. The goal shifts from learning to performing well within the system. Education becomes a rehearsal for participation in larger structures, workplaces, institutions, and social hierarchies, where conformity is often valued over reflection. Conditioning works best when it feels neutral. Students are told they are being prepared for the real world, but the world they are prepared for is rarely questioned. The assumptions embedded in curricula, what matters, what is normal, what is possible, are absorbed unconsciously. This creates limits on imagination before awareness even develops. People graduate knowing how to follow procedures, meet expectations, and avoid mistakes, but often lacking the confidence to challenge foundational ideas. Another layer of conditioning lies in competition. Grades, rankings, and comparisons teach individuals to measure their worth externally. Learning becomes transactional. Knowledge is pursued for reward, not understanding. This reinforces obedience because authority controls evaluation. When approval determines opportunity, questioning becomes a liability. Education also conditions time and attention. The rhythm of bells, deadlines, and standardized pacing trains individuals to accept externally imposed structures as natural. This normalization of control carries into adulthood, making rigid systems feel familiar rather than restrictive. By the time people encounter harmful systems later in life, they have already internalized the habits required to function within them silently. This does not mean education is inherently oppressive, but it means that when education prioritizes adaptation over awareness, it serves power more than truth. Conditioning is effective because it is gradual and disguised as preparation. The result is a population skilled at functioning within systems, but hesitant to imagine life beyond them, until education encourages not just answers, but genuine questioning, and not just success, but conscious understanding. It will continue to shape individuals who are well-trained, well-adjusted, and quietly unfree. Questioning is often presented as a virtue in theory, but punished in practice. When a system feels threatened by inquiry, it rarely responds with open repression. Instead, it shifts the tone. The questioner is not silenced directly. They are ridiculed. Mockery becomes a powerful tool because it delegitimizes without argument. Once a question is treated as laughable, it no longer requires an answer. This transition from questioning to mockery marks a critical stage in social control. At first, questions are ignored. If they persist, they are reframed as naive, exaggerated, or irrational. The questioner is portrayed as confused, dramatic, or seeking attention. This framing shifts focus away from the content of the question and onto the character of the person asking it. Social groups quickly absorb this signal. Laughter replaces debate. Mockery creates social distance. It tells others that engaging seriously with the question risks association with foolishness. As a result, people withdraw not because the question lacks merit, but because they fear becoming a target themselves. This is how inquiry is neutralized without censorship. Mockery is especially effective in public spaces where visibility matters. The fear of embarrassment outweighs the desire for truth. People learn to self-edit, to soften their doubts, or to remain silent altogether. Over time, questioning itself becomes stigmatized. Only approved forms of critique are allowed, those that do not challenge the foundation of the system. When mockery is normalized, systems no longer need to justify themselves. They rely on social cues to enforce boundaries. Those who comply are rewarded with belonging. Those who question are isolated through humor. This process reshapes culture. Curiosity gives way to conformity, and seriousness is replaced by surface-level discourse. The system remains unexamined, not because it is strong, but because questioning it has been made socially uncomfortable. In this environment, the most effective form of control is not fear of punishment, but fear of ridicule. And when mockery replaces discussion, truth quietly exits the conversation, leaving only what is safe to laugh at. Human beings have a deep psychological need for their pain to mean something. Suffering without explanation feels unbearable, so the mind searches for reasons, even when those reasons protect the very systems causing harm. This is the foundation of how suffering becomes justified. When people endure hardship under a system, they cannot easily escape. Accepting that the system is unjust would create intolerable internal conflict. To resolve this tension, the mind reframes suffering as necessary, deserved, or purposeful. Pain is transformed into sacrifice. Sacrifice becomes virtue. This psychological shift allows individuals to preserve a sense of dignity while remaining within harmful structures. Justifying suffering reduces cognitive dissonance. If the pain is meaningful, then endurance is noble rather than tragic. This reframing protects the self from despair but it also protects the system from scrutiny. Over time, people begin to defend the conditions that harm them, because admitting those conditions are wrong would invalidate their past endurance. The longer someone suffers, the stronger the need to believe the suffering was not in vain. This is why systems that demand sacrifice often inspire loyalty. They offer narratives that glorify endurance, discipline, and resilience. People internalize these stories and measure their worth by how much they can tolerate. Complaint becomes weakness. Questioning becomes ingratitude. In this way, suffering is moralized rather than addressed. Another layer of this psychology lies in comparison. When suffering is widespread, individual pain feels normalized. People tell themselves others have it worse. This minimizes urgency and reinforces acceptance. The system benefits from this competition of pain because it fragments solidarity. Justifying suffering also shifts focus from causes to character. If someone struggles, it is framed as a personal failure rather than a structural issue. This isolates individuals and prevents collective awareness. The psychological burden is carried privately while the system remains untouched. In the end, justifying suffering offers emotional survival at the cost of freedom. It soothes the mind by providing meaning, but it prevents change by disguising harm as necessity. As long as suffering is explained rather than questioned, systems that cause it remain morally intact. And the most tragic outcome is not that people suffer, but that they come to believe they should. When law replaces morality, obedience becomes more important than conscience, and legality begins to stand in for justice. Laws are meant to reflect ethical principles, but when systems grow rigid, the relationship reverses. What is legal is assumed to be right, and what is illegal is assumed to be wrong, regardless of harm. This shift is dangerous because it transfers moral responsibility away from individuals and into abstract rules. People stop asking whether an action is just and ask only whether it is permitted. The law becomes a moral shield, allowing individuals to participate in harmful actions while feeling innocent. They tell themselves they followed the rules, that they did what was required, that responsibility lies elsewhere. In this way, law simplifies ethics. It removes ambiguity, and ambiguity is uncomfortable. When morality is internal, it demands reflection, empathy, and courage. When morality is externalized into law, it demands compliance. This is why systems prefer law over conscience. Laws can be enforced uniformly, morality cannot. History is filled with examples of legal systems that upheld slavery, segregation, discrimination, and violence, while ordinary people participated without seeing themselves as immoral. The law gave permission, and permission felt like absolution. Once legality replaces morality, questioning becomes deviance. Those who resist unjust laws are framed as criminals rather than moral agents. The focus shifts from harm to order, from suffering to stability. This inversion protects systems by redefining wrongdoing as disobedience rather than injustice. People begin to fear breaking rules more than causing harm because the consequences are clearer. The punishment for illegality is immediate. The consequences of immorality are abstract. When law becomes the primary moral reference point, ethical reasoning atrophies. People lose the habit of asking whether something should be done. They ask only whether it can be done. This creates societies that function efficiently while causing quiet damage, where cruelty can be organized, bureaucratized, and justified through procedure. The most dangerous aspect of this shift is not that laws exist, but that they are mistaken for ethics. When morality is reduced to compliance, systems gain immense power because they no longer need to convince, they only need to legislate. And as long as people equate legality with goodness, harm can persist indefinitely, hidden behind the comforting certainty of rules. What is unacceptable rarely becomes normal overnight. It enters slowly through repetition, justification, and gradual adjustment. At first, it shocks, then it unsettles, and eventually it blends into the background of everyday life. This is how harmful systems survive. They do not demand acceptance all at once. They introduce small compromises, minor exceptions, temporary measures. Each step feels tolerable in isolation, but together they redraw the boundaries of what is considered normal. People adapt faster than they realize. The human mind is remarkably flexible when it comes to survival. Once something becomes routine, it stops triggering emotional alarm. What once felt wrong begins to feel inevitable. Language plays a crucial role in this process. Unacceptable actions are renamed. They are softened through euphemisms and technical terms. Harm becomes policy. Control becomes security. Exclusion becomes regulation. By changing the words, the emotional weight is reduced. People no longer react to the reality, they react to the label. This linguistic distance allows individuals to participate without fully confronting the consequences. Normalization is reinforced by comparison. When worse scenarios are constantly invoked, current harm appears reasonable. People are told it could be worse, that this is the lesser evil, that sacrifices are necessary. This framing shifts attention away from what should be questioned and toward what should be endured. As long as something is not the worst imaginable, it becomes acceptable enough. Social reinforcement completes the process. When others accept the unacceptable, it feels safer to follow than to resist. Deviation stands out more than conformity, so people adjust their moral compass to align with the group. What is normalized is no longer debated, it is assumed, and once assumption replaces reflection, change becomes difficult. The most dangerous aspect of normalization is that it numbs moral sensitivity. People stop noticing gradual erosion. They wake up one day inside a reality they would have rejected if it had arrived suddenly. Harm persists not because people agree with it, but because they have learned to live around it. Normalizing the unacceptable is not an act of cruelty, it is an act of adaptation, and adaptation, when left unexamined, can turn almost anything into normal life. As long as harm arrives quietly and consistently, it can become invisible, and invisible harm is the easiest to protect. The myth of "there is no alternative" is one of the most powerful narratives used to protect harmful systems. It does not argue that the system is good, it argues that it is inevitable. This distinction matters because inevitability shuts down imagination more effectively than force ever could. When people are told there is no alternative, they stop evaluating, they stop comparing, they stop dreaming. The system no longer has to justify itself. It only has to present itself as reality. This myth works by framing the present arrangement as natural, unchangeable, or the final stage of progress. Any suggestion of a different way is dismissed as naive, utopian, or dangerous. The past is rewritten to show that every attempt at change failed. The future is painted as chaos if the system is questioned. In this way, possibility itself becomes threatening. When no alternative is imaginable, obedience feels rational. Resistance feels irresponsible. People are not convinced, they are cornered. The myth also shifts responsibility. If there is no alternative, then suffering is unfortunate but unavoidable. Pain becomes a fact of life rather than a consequence of choices. This removes moral urgency and replaces it with resignation. People learn to adapt instead of challenge. They invest energy in coping strategies rather than transformation. The system benefits from this exhaustion because tired minds rarely rebel. Another layer of this myth is comparison. Alternatives are not examined honestly, they are caricatured. Extremes are presented as the only other options. This false binary traps thought between acceptance and fear. By narrowing the field of imagination, the system controls not only action, but thought itself. Over time, the myth becomes internalized. People repeat it even when no authority demands it. They police each other's hopes. They mock those who imagine change. They call realism what is often just learned helplessness. This is how the myth sustains itself. It does not need enforcement. It lives in language, habits, and expectations. The danger of "there is no alternative" is not that it is persuasive, but that it feels obvious. Once accepted, it turns the present into a prison without walls. As long as people believe there is no other way, any way will be tolerated. And the most radical act in such a system is not rebellion but imagination, because the moment an alternative is truly envisioned, the myth collapses, and with it, the quiet power of inevitability. Language is one of the most subtle and powerful tools through which authority protects itself, because it shapes how reality is perceived before it is judged. Power rarely relies on silence alone. It relies on controlled meaning. By defining words, framing events, and limiting acceptable expressions, systems influence what people notice, what they ignore, and how they feel about both. When language is managed, power no longer needs to argue. It only needs to name. Through language, harm is softened. Actions that would provoke outrage are rebranded with neutral or technical terms. Violence becomes enforcement. Exploitation becomes efficiency. Surveillance becomes safety. By stripping emotional weight from words, language creates distance between action and consequence. People react less because the language feels clean, official, and impersonal. This abstraction allows individuals to participate in harmful processes without fully confronting their impact. Language also protects power by narrowing thought. The words available to describe an experience shape how that experience is understood. If there is no widely accepted language for injustice, people struggle to articulate it. Discomfort remains vague. Unease feels personal rather than systemic. Without language to name a problem, resistance remains fragmented. Power thrives in this ambiguity. Another function of language is normalization. When certain phrases are repeated consistently, they become background noise. The mind stops questioning them. Terms like necessary measures, public interest, or national security are rarely examined, yet they justify immense control. These phrases operate as linguistic shields. They end discussion before it begins. Challenging them feels unreasonable because the language itself frames opposition as irresponsible. Language also establishes moral boundaries. Who is described as normal, productive, or deserving, and who is labeled as deviant, ungrateful, or dangerous is rarely accidental. These labels shape empathy. They determine whose suffering matters and whose can be ignored. Once a group is linguistically reduced to a category, it becomes easier to dismiss their humanity. In this way, language organizes moral attention. Power further protects itself by controlling tone. Certain ways of speaking are considered serious, respectable, and legitimate. Others are dismissed as emotional, extreme, or unprofessional. This tone policing ensures that only system-compatible criticism is heard. Any challenge that disrupts the accepted style is discredited before its content is addressed. Over time, people internalize these linguistic limits. They adjust how they speak, what they say, and what they leave unsaid. They censor themselves not because they are forbidden, but because they have learned what sounds acceptable. This is how language becomes invisible control. It does not force silence, it teaches restraint. As long as power controls the words used to describe reality, it controls reality's meaning. And when meaning is controlled, obedience follows quietly, disguised as understanding. When survival becomes ideology, existence is reduced to endurance rather than meaning. What begins as a natural instinct to stay alive is transformed into a moral framework that justifies almost anything. Once survival is elevated above all other values, questions of justice, freedom, and dignity are pushed aside. People are told that as long as they are surviving, the system must be working. This logic is powerful because it appeals to fear. Survival feels urgent, it feels unquestionable. But when survival becomes the highest good, it becomes a tool of control. Systems frame their demands as necessities. They claim sacrifice is required, that suffering is unavoidable, that resistance risks collapse. In this environment, any critique is dismissed as dangerous idealism. People are taught that questioning the system threatens survival itself. So obedience becomes moral and dissent becomes reckless. Survival ideology narrows imagination. It reduces human potential to basic continuation rather than fulfillment. People stop asking how they want to live and focus only on how to endure. The future shrinks into short-term stability. Long-term harm is tolerated because immediate survival dominates concern. This creates populations willing to accept exploitation, inequality, and control as long as life continues in some form. The system benefits because it never has to promise flourishing, only persistence. When survival becomes ideology, responsibility shifts away from those in power. If people are alive, the system is declared successful. Any suffering is reframed as the price of existence rather than the result of choices. This absolves authority and places the burden on individuals to adapt, resist quietly, or endure silently. Over time, this ideology reshapes identity. People begin to see themselves not as agents, but as survivors. Resilience replaces hope, endurance replaces imagination. And once people define themselves by survival alone, they will defend the very structures that exhaust them, because those structures are framed as the reason they are still standing. The tragedy of survival as ideology is that it convinces people that staying alive is the same as living. And as long as that belief holds, power can demand almost anything, as long as it allows people to continue breathing within the limits it sets. Obedience feels comfortable because it removes weight from the mind. The weight of choice, the weight of responsibility, the weight of uncertainty. When a system clearly defines what is allowed, what is forbidden, and what is expected, life becomes simpler. Decisions no longer feel personal, they feel procedural. This shift brings relief. Uncertainty is one of the greatest sources of psychological stress, and obedience promises protection from it. By following rules, people avoid the anxiety of moral ambiguity. They do not have to ask whether something is right. They only have to ask whether it is permitted. This reduction of complexity feels like safety, even when it comes at the cost of freedom. Obedience also offers emotional shelter. In chaotic or unstable environments, structure feels reassuring. Hierarchy feels predictable. Routines feel calming. The human nervous system relaxes when outcomes seem controlled. Harmful systems exploit this response. They do not need to convince people that obedience is good. They only need to convince them that disobedience is risky. Over time, obedience becomes associated with peace and resistance with danger. Not always physical danger, but social conflict, uncertainty, and isolation. This association shapes behavior long before conscious thought intervenes. Another source of comfort lies in moral outsourcing. When people obey, they transfer responsibility upward. If the outcome is harmful, they can tell themselves they were only following rules. This softens guilt and protects self-image. Obedience allows individuals to see themselves as decent, even while participating in harmful processes. The system absorbs blame. The individual preserves innocence. This psychological distance makes obedience not only comfortable, but attractive. As obedience is rewarded with approval, belonging, or stability, it becomes habitual. People begin to define goodness as compliance rather than conscience. Resistance feels disruptive. It threatens inner calm. It forces confrontation with doubt and fear. So even when discomfort arises, people suppress it for the sake of peace. This is the quiet danger of obedience. It does not feel like submission. It feels like rest, but beneath that rest lies surrender of awareness. When obedience becomes a source of comfort, freedom begins to feel heavy. Independent thought feels exhausting, and systems no longer need to enforce control because people willingly maintain it themselves, seeking the calm that obedience provides, even when that calm is built on silent harm. The fear of standing alone is one of the deepest forces shaping human behavior, because isolation threatens more than comfort. It threatens identity. From an evolutionary perspective, belonging meant survival. To be separated from the group once meant vulnerability, exposure, and death. That ancient fear still echoes in modern minds, even when physical survival is no longer at stake. When a person considers questioning a dominant system, what they often feel first is not anger or courage, but the quiet terror of being alone. To stand apart is to risk losing recognition, validation, and shared reality. Groups provide mirrors. They tell individuals who they are, what is normal, and what is acceptable. When someone steps outside that frame, the mirror disappears. The self feels unstable. This is why conformity feels safe. It anchors identity in collective agreement. Standing alone requires facing uncertainty, not only about the world, but about oneself. Harmful systems exploit this fear by linking belonging to obedience. Agreement becomes the price of inclusion. Dissent becomes social exile. People are not silenced by force, but by the anticipation of loneliness. They imagine being misunderstood, judged, or dismissed. This imagined isolation is often enough to stop action before it begins. Even when individuals privately disagree, they remain outwardly loyal because solitude feels heavier than injustice. The fear of standing alone also distorts perception. When many people remain silent, it appears as consensus. This false consensus reinforces fear. Each person believes they are the only one who doubts, so they hide their doubt. And because everyone hides, the illusion persists. This is how isolation multiplies itself. The system does not need to suppress opposition. It lets people suppress themselves. Standing alone also demands strength that few are taught to cultivate. It requires internal validation, the ability to tolerate disapproval, and the courage to exist without immediate affirmation. Most social structures do not reward these traits. They reward alignment. So people learn to equate goodness with agreement and morality with numbers. The lone dissenter feels wrong simply because they are alone. This emotional pressure is immense, and yet history shows that change almost always begins in isolation. Before movements form, before voices multiply, there is always someone who stands alone first. The fear is real, but so is its cost. As long as standing alone feels more dangerous than standing for truth, systems that harm will remain protected by crowds of people who disagree quietly but comply together. Conformity is rarely enforced through punishment alone. It is encouraged through reward. Systems understand that people are more easily guided by incentives than by fear. When individuals align with expectations, they are often met with approval, opportunity, and recognition. This reinforcement teaches a powerful lesson. Agreement leads to comfort. Meanwhile, those who resist may not be punished directly, but they are quietly excluded. They miss promotions, visibility, or social acceptance. This contrast trains behavior without the need for overt control. The reward of conformity operates on many levels. At a social level, conforming individuals receive validation. They are seen as reasonable, mature, and responsible. This positive feedback strengthens identity. People begin to associate their sense of worth with how well they fit in. At an institutional level, conformity is rewarded with stability. Secure positions, predictable outcomes, and access to resources are often reserved for those who do not disrupt existing structures. This creates a silent hierarchy where compliance equals success. Over time, conformity becomes aspirational. People do not merely obey, they want to belong to the group that benefits. The system does not have to demand loyalty, it becomes desirable. Conformity also reduces friction. Life feels smoother when one moves with the current rather than against it. This ease is seductive. People convince themselves that alignment is not a compromise, but a rational choice. The rewards feel earned, not conditional. This perception masks the trade-off being made. While conforming brings short-term comfort, it narrows long-term possibility. As people adjust their beliefs and behavior to maintain rewards, they slowly lose the capacity to imagine alternatives. The system remains unchallenged, not because it is flawless, but because challenging it carries hidden costs. When conformity is consistently rewarded and questioning is quietly penalized, people learn what is valued without being told. The most effective control is not coercion, but attraction. By making compliance profitable, power ensures its own stability, carried forward by those who believe they are simply succeeding on their own terms. When people cannot escape a system, defending it often becomes a psychological necessity rather than a conscious choice. Being trapped creates an unbearable tension. If a system is harmful and there is no clear way out, acknowledging that harm fully would mean living in constant despair. To survive emotionally, the mind adapts, begins to reinterpret the system in less threatening terms. What cannot be changed is reframed as acceptable. What cannot be escaped is reframed as necessary. This is not loyalty, it is self-protection. When escape feels impossible, criticism feels dangerous. Not because it changes reality, but because it deepens suffering. By defending the system, people soften the pain of powerlessness. They convince themselves that things are not as bad as they seem, that the system has benefits, that the alternatives would be worse. This justification restores a sense of control. Even if that control is only mental, defense becomes a coping mechanism. The longer someone remains trapped, the stronger this mechanism grows. Time invested becomes emotional evidence. Admitting the system is unjust would mean admitting years of endurance were wasted. So people double down. They protect the structure that confines them, because dismantling it in thought would collapse their sense of meaning. This is why criticism from outsiders often triggers anger. It threatens the fragile balance that allows survival. The outsider can leave, the insider cannot. So the insider defends, not because they believe deeply, but because belief is less painful than despair. Defending the inescapable also restores dignity. To admit powerlessness feels humiliating. To frame endurance as choice feels empowering. People say they stay because they agree, not because they must. This illusion of agency preserves self-respect, but it also locks them in place. History shows this pattern everywhere. Workers defending exploitative systems, citizens justifying authoritarian rule, individuals rationalizing environments that drain them. The defense is not irrational, it is human. When escape is blocked, alignment feels safer than resistance. And as long as people are forced to adapt rather than choose, systems gain their strongest shield. Not fear, but rationalization. The tragedy is that the mind's attempt to survive can end up protecting the very conditions it longs to escape. Fear rarely controls people forever on its own. It is too exhausting. To persist, it must transform into something quieter. This transformation happens when fear becomes habit. At first, behavior is shaped by anxiety. People comply because they are afraid of consequences. Punishment, exclusion, instability. Each decision carries tension. Each act of obedience feels deliberate. Over time, however, the nervous system adapts. What was once frightening becomes familiar, and familiarity dulls emotional response. Actions repeated under fear gradually lose their urgency. They become routine. Once fear fades into habit, control becomes efficient. People no longer feel afraid, they feel normal. The system no longer needs to threaten because behavior continues automatically. Habits operate below conscious awareness. They bypass reflection. When obedience becomes habitual, it is no longer questioned. The individual stops remembering why they comply. They only know that this is how things are done. This is the most stable form of control because it does not rely on constant pressure. Fear trains the behavior. Habit maintains it. This shift also changes identity. What begins as survival becomes character. People start describing themselves as practical, realistic, or just doing what everyone does. They confuse adaptation with agreement. The system benefits because resistance now feels strange, even dangerous. Not because of fear, but because it breaks routine. Habit creates comfort. The body relaxes into repetition, and comfort discourages reflection. The longer a habit persists, the harder it is to imagine alternatives because imagination requires interruption. This is why oppressive systems often endure long after the original threat disappears. The fear that created obedience may fade, but the behavior remains. Habits outlive their causes. They continue silently passed down through norms, rituals, and expectations. From fear to habit is the final stage of internalized control. At this point, people are not forced, they are trained. And training is far more durable than fear because it becomes part of everyday life, carried forward without resistance, question, or awareness. Conformity is sustained less by threat than by reward. Systems quickly learn that approval, access, and recognition guide behavior more effectively than punishment. When people align with expectations, they are met with subtle benefits. Acceptance, visibility, opportunity. These rewards feel natural, even deserved, so the exchange goes unnoticed. Agreement appears to lead to progress, while deviation quietly stalls advancement. This contrast teaches behavior without explicit rules. At a social level, conformity is rewarded with belonging. People who fit the dominant narrative are seen as reasonable, stable, and mature. This validation feeds identity. Individuals begin to equate being accepted with being right. At an institutional level, conformity is rewarded with security. Predictable careers, steady income, and protected status are more accessible to those who do not challenge the structure. The system does not need to silence critics aggressively. It simply advances others instead. Over time, conformity becomes aspirational. People don't just obey, they aim to align. The rewards make compliance feel like success rather than compromise. This reframing is powerful. It masks the cost of conformity by presenting it as common sense. The ease of moving with the system feels efficient, responsible, and practical. Resistance, by contrast, appears risky and unnecessary. When rewards accumulate, they also create dependence. People invest their identity in what the system gives them. To question the system would threaten not only comfort, but status and self-worth. So they defend it, not out of belief, but out of self-preservation. The most effective reward of conformity is psychological. The relief of not standing out, not struggling alone, not risking loss. By making alignment profitable, power secures loyalty without coercion. In such an environment, control feels voluntary because people believe they are simply choosing what works best for them, while the system quietly ensures that only one choice truly pays. Fear often survives by disguising itself as common sense. When anxiety is repeated long enough, it stops feeling emotional and starts feeling rational. People no longer say they are afraid. They say they are being realistic. This shift is crucial because fear presented as reason is rarely questioned. Harmful systems rely on this transformation. They frame caution as wisdom, hesitation as maturity, and obedience as practicality. What begins as fear of loss, conflict, or instability is gradually reframed as logical restraint. Statements like, "That's just how the world works," or "You have to be realistic," sound neutral, but often carry unexamined anxiety beneath them. When fear wears the language of common sense, it becomes socially acceptable. People repeat it confidently, they pass it on as advice, they teach it to the next generation. This normalizes limitation without ever naming it as fear. Those who question the system are then framed as reckless, naive, or idealistic, not because their ideas are flawed, but because they disrupt the emotional comfort built around caution. Common sense becomes a boundary marker. It defines what is thinkable and what is dismissed. Before any debate begins, the terms are already set. Over time, this disguised fear shapes identity. People begin to see themselves as sensible adults because they avoid risk. They equate safety with intelligence and restraint with virtue. This discourages imagination and moral courage. The system benefits because it never has to justify its restrictions. They are accepted as obvious necessities. Fear disguised as common sense is powerful because it feels self-evident. It requires no enforcement, only repetition. As long as fear is mistaken for wisdom, people will protect the very structures that confine them, believing they are simply being practical, when in reality they are obeying an anxiety they no longer recognize as fear. Being normal comes at a price that is rarely discussed, because normality is presented as safety rather than sacrifice. From early on, people learn that fitting in brings protection. Approval follows those who behave as expected, think within accepted limits, and express the right emotions at the right time. This reward system teaches a quiet lesson. Deviation is dangerous. Normality becomes a shield against scrutiny, but it also becomes a cage. The cost of being normal is the gradual surrender of authenticity. To remain acceptable, people edit themselves. They soften doubts, hide contradictions, and silence instincts that do not align with the group. Over time, this self-editing feels natural. The individual forgets what was removed. They confuse adaptation with identity. Normality demands predictability, and predictability requires suppression. What does not fit is pushed inward or erased. This creates inner tension, even if it is not consciously felt. The person appears stable but feels oddly empty. Normality also discourages moral courage. When everyone agrees on what is normal, questioning it feels inappropriate, even rude. People fear being seen as difficult, dramatic, or ungrateful. So they choose comfort over clarity. The price of this choice is awareness. By staying normal, people avoid conflict, but they also avoid growth. They inherit beliefs instead of examining them. They repeat patterns instead of challenging them. The system benefits because normal people maintain stability without resistance. They keep things running. They do not ask why. This price is paid quietly. No one announces it. There is no clear moment of loss. There is only gradual narrowing. The range of acceptable thought shrinks. The imagination dulls. The ability to stand alone weakens. And eventually, normality feels like the only way to exist. The tragedy is that being normal feels safe, but it often requires giving up the parts of oneself that could imagine something better. As long as normality is treated as virtue, those who question it will seem strange. And as long as that is true, systems that rely on conformity will remain protected, not by force, but by the high cost people are willing to pay just to be seen as normal. Endurance becomes a virtue when suffering is no longer questioned, but praised. When systems cannot eliminate pain, they often redefine it. They frame endurance as strength, patience as morality, and tolerance of hardship as character. This shift is subtle but powerful. It transforms structural harm into personal achievement. People are taught that those who endure without complaint are admirable, while those who question are weak or ungrateful. This moral framing discourages resistance without the need for force. If suffering is virtuous, then challenging its source feels shameful. When endurance is elevated, attention moves away from causes and toward behavior. The focus becomes how well individuals tolerate pain, not why the pain exists. This benefits systems that rely on continuous strain. They no longer have to improve conditions. They only have to celebrate resilience. Endurance becomes a badge of honor, a measure of worth. People begin to compare how much they can survive. They compete in sacrifice. This normalizes exhaustion and reframes damage as dedication. Over time, people internalize this value. They push themselves beyond healthy limits. They silence their own discomfort. They interpret burnout as failure of character rather than evidence of injustice. The system remains intact because critique is replaced by admiration for those who cope best. This virtue of endurance also isolates individuals. Suffering is endured privately, not shared collectively. Complaint feels like weakness. Solidarity dissolves into individual toughness. As long as endurance is moralized, systems that cause harm are protected from scrutiny. The greatest danger of this mindset is that it confuses survival with goodness. Just because someone can endure does not mean they should have to. When endurance becomes a virtue, people stop asking whether a system is humane. They ask only whether they are strong enough to survive it. And in that shift, the line between resilience and resignation quietly disappears. When endurance becomes a virtue, suffering is no longer treated as a problem to be solved, but as a quality to be admired. Systems that cannot justify the harm they produce often survive by reframing that harm as character building. Pain is no longer evidence of failure. It becomes proof of strength. People are praised for lasting longer, for complaining less, for adapting more. This moral shift is powerful because it turns structural pressure into personal responsibility. If endurance is good, then those who struggle are not victims. They are lacking. People learn to measure their worth by how much they can tolerate. They internalize the belief that difficulty is normal and exhaustion is honorable. When endurance is celebrated, attention shifts away from causes and toward behavior. The question is no longer why conditions are harsh, but whether individuals are resilient enough to handle them. This benefits systems that rely on constant strain because criticism is replaced with admiration for those who cope best. Suffering becomes individualized and competitive. People compare their limits instead of questioning why limits are being pushed at all. Complaint is framed as weakness. Resistance is reframed as entitlement. Silence becomes maturity. Over time, this mindset reshapes identity. People begin to suppress signals of harm. They ignore burnout. They reinterpret damage as growth. The system remains untouched because pain has been moralized. The most dangerous aspect of this transformation is that it confuses survival with virtue. Just because someone can endure does not mean they should have to. When endurance becomes a virtue, inhuman conditions are normalized, and questioning them feels immoral. In that moment, resilience stops being a strength and becomes a leash, keeping people moving forward in systems that exhaust them, while convincing them that enduring the harm is not only necessary, but good. The fear of being wrong is one of the quietest yet strongest forces that keeps people loyal to harmful systems. Being wrong is not just an intellectual mistake. It threatens identity, self-worth, and social standing. To admit error means admitting that past choices, beliefs, and sacrifices may have been misguided. For many people, this realization feels more painful than continuing to endure harm. The longer someone has defended a system, the harder it becomes to question it, not because the evidence is lacking, but because the emotional cost is too high. Admitting you were wrong can feel like erasing years of meaning, effort, and loyalty, so the mind protects itself by doubling down. This fear also operates socially. Being wrong in public risks humiliation, loss of respect, and exclusion. In systems where conformity is rewarded, changing one's mind is framed as weakness or inconsistency rather than growth. People learn that certainty is valued more than honesty, confidence more than reflection. As a result, they cling to positions even when doubts arise, not to protect truth, but to protect dignity. The fear of being wrong turns belief into armor. Once worn, it becomes heavy, but removing it feels dangerous. Harmful systems benefit enormously from this fear. They do not need to silence critics aggressively. They only need to make error feel shameful. When being wrong is associated with stupidity, naivety, or moral failure, people stop revising their views. They stop learning. Defense replaces curiosity. Justification replaces understanding. Over time, being right becomes less important than not being exposed as wrong. This fear also freezes moral growth. If acknowledging injustice means admitting complicity, many will choose denial instead. It feels safer to reinterpret reality than to confront responsibility. In this way, the fear of being wrong keeps people aligned long after belief has faded. What remains is not conviction, but protection of the self. True freedom requires the ability to say, "I was wrong," without collapse. But systems that rely on obedience make that admission feel unbearable. As long as being wrong feels more threatening than being harmed, people will continue to defend what hurts them, not because they believe in it deeply, but because the truth feels too costly to face. Fear often survives by disguising itself as common sense. What begins as anxiety slowly reshapes itself into advice, rules, and realistic thinking. People stop saying they are afraid and start saying they are being sensible. This transformation is powerful because fear, once framed as logic, is rarely questioned. Systems benefit from this shift. They no longer need to intimidate. They simply encourage caution, restraint, and practicality. Phrases like, "That's just how things work," "Don't be naive," or "Be realistic" sound reasonable, but they often carry unexamined fear beneath them. Fear of loss, fear of isolation, fear of instability, all compressed into what appears to be wisdom. When fear wears the mask of common sense, it becomes socially approved. It is repeated confidently and passed down as guidance. Children learn it as maturity. Adults enforce it as responsibility. Those who challenge it are dismissed as reckless, immature, or idealistic, not because their ideas are flawed, but because they disturb the emotional comfort that fear provides. Common sense becomes a boundary that defines what is acceptable to imagine. Before discussion even begins, the limits are already set. Over time, this disguised fear shapes identity. People begin to see themselves as smart and grounded because they avoid risk. They equate safety with intelligence and caution with virtue. Imagination is treated as danger. Moral courage is treated as foolishness. The system no longer needs to justify itself because its constraints are accepted as obvious necessities. Fear has been normalized. The danger is not that people are afraid, but that they no longer recognize fear as fear. When anxiety feels like reason, it becomes invisible, and invisible fear is the most reliable form of control. As long as fear continues to sound like common sense, people will protect the systems that confine them, believing they are simply being practical, while quietly surrendering the possibility of change. Constant survival exhausts the human spirit long before it breaks the body. When life becomes a continuous effort to endure, to adapt, to stay afloat, there is little energy left for reflection, imagination, or resistance. Survival mode narrows attention. The mind focuses on immediate needs, security, stability, avoidance of loss. Long-term thinking fades. This exhaustion is not accidental. It is deeply functional for systems that rely on compliance. People who are tired do not rebel, they cope. When every day feels like a test of endurance, questioning the structure that creates that pressure feels like an extra burden. Constant survival drains moral energy. Individuals may still sense injustice, but they no longer feel capable of confronting it. The cost feels too high. They tell themselves they will think about change later when things are calmer. But calm never comes because the system thrives on keeping people just stable enough to continue, never rested enough to reflect. This creates a population that is permanently busy, permanently stressed, and permanently adaptable. Exhaustion also reshapes values. Peace becomes the absence of immediate crisis, not the presence of dignity. Rest becomes indulgence. Hope feels unrealistic. Survival replaces aspiration. People begin to measure success not by fulfillment, but by endurance. Did I make it through the week? Did I avoid collapse? In this state, anything that threatens routine feels dangerous, even if routine itself is harmful. The system is protected not by belief, but by fatigue. Constant survival also isolates. Since everyone is struggling privately, collective awareness weakens. People assume others are coping better. They blame themselves for their exhaustion rather than questioning why exhaustion is universal. This internalization prevents solidarity. The struggle feels personal, not systemic. And because survival demands constant adjustment, people become highly adaptable but quietly numb. They lose sensitivity to harm because noticing it would require energy they no longer have. This is the final cruelty of constant survival. It consumes the very strength needed to escape it. As long as people are kept busy surviving, they will have little capacity to imagine living. And a system that reduces life to endurance does not need to be defended passionately. It only needs to keep people too tired to leave. Silence can feel responsible when speaking is framed as risk rather than necessity. In many systems, people are taught that stability depends on restraint, that raising concerns might cause conflict, panic, or harm. So choosing not to speak is presented as maturity, wisdom, or care. This framing is powerful because it turns inaction into virtue. People convince themselves that staying quiet is the ethical choice, that protecting calm matters more than confronting injustice. When silence is moralized, it no longer feels like avoidance, it feels like duty. This sense of responsibility is reinforced socially. Those who speak out are labeled disruptive, emotional, or irresponsible. They are accused of making things worse. Meanwhile, those who remain silent are praised for being reasonable and level-headed. This contrast teaches behavior quickly. People learn that silence preserves belonging, while speech risks isolation. Over time, the fear of consequences is replaced by a belief that silence itself is good. When silence feels responsible, accountability dissolves. Harm continues, but no one feels personally responsible because everyone believes they are protecting something larger. People wait for the right moment, the proper channel, the perfect words. That moment never arrives. Injustice is postponed indefinitely under the excuse of caution. This mindset also narrows moral imagination. People stop asking whether something is wrong and start asking whether it is appropriate to mention it. Concern is filtered through politeness. Ethics are subordinated to tone. The system benefits because critique is neutralized before it is expressed. No censorship is needed. When silence is experienced as responsibility, systems gain their most reliable defense. People who believe they are doing the right thing by doing nothing. And as long as restraint feels virtuous, truth remains unspoken while harm continues quietly, protected by the belief that speaking would be worse. The fear of being wrong is one of the strongest invisible forces holding people inside harmful systems. Being wrong is not experienced as a simple correction of ideas. It feels like a threat to identity, self-respect, and meaning. To admit error is to face the possibility that years of belief, effort, and sacrifice were misplaced. For many people, this realization feels more painful than continuing to endure harm. So the mind protects itself by resisting doubt even when evidence accumulates. The longer someone has defended a position, the more emotionally invested they become. And the higher the investment, the higher the cost of admitting mistake. This fear grows stronger with time. Once a belief has shaped friendships, career choices, public statements, or moral identity, letting it go feels like collapse. People do not just fear being wrong, they fear what being wrong would destroy. If I was wrong, what does that say about my judgment? If I was wrong, what was all that suffering for? If I was wrong, who am I now? These questions are destabilizing, so instead of revising beliefs, people reinterpret reality. They explain away contradictions. They attack messengers. They narrow what counts as acceptable evidence. This is not dishonesty. It is psychological self-defense. Social pressure intensifies this fear. Being wrong in private is uncomfortable. Being wrong in public feels humiliating. In systems that reward certainty and punish hesitation, changing one's mind is framed as weakness, inconsistency, or lack of character. People learn that confidence matters more than accuracy. As a result, they cling to positions not because they believe deeply, but because retreat feels socially dangerous. The fear of ridicule, loss of status, or exclusion keeps people frozen, even when doubt grows internally. Harmful systems exploit this fear expertly. They moralize correctness. They attach virtue to loyalty and shame to revision. Once being wrong is associated with stupidity, immorality, or betrayal, people stop learning. They stop updating. They stop listening. Defense replaces curiosity. Justification replaces understanding. The system no longer needs to suppress dissent. Individuals suppress themselves to avoid the pain of admitting error. This fear also blocks moral responsibility. If acknowledging injustice means acknowledging participation, many will choose denial instead. It feels safer to protect a flawed belief than to confront complicity. In this way, the fear of being wrong becomes a prison. It locks people into past versions of themselves, even as reality changes around them. True growth requires the ability to say, "I was wrong," and survive that realization. But systems built on obedience make that admission feel catastrophic. As long as being wrong feels more dangerous than being harmed, people will continue to defend what hurts them. Not because they believe it is right, but because the truth feels too costly to accept. There is a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when you realize you are not free. And what defines that moment is not fear. It is not shock. It is what comes after. You notice the limits. You sense the constraints. You recognize the patterns shaping your choices. You see how narrow the path really is. And for a brief second, clarity appears. This is not freedom. This is permission. This is not choice. This is management. But then nothing happens. You return to routine. You adjust. You continue. That moment passes without action. This is one of the most decisive points in a person's life, not because of what is understood, but because of what is accepted. Realizing you are not free does not automatically lead to resistance. More often, it leads to accommodation. The mind calculates risk. The cost of disruption feels too high. The consequences of action feel immediate, while the consequences of inaction feel distant. So you postpone. You tell yourself it is not the right time, that you are not ready, that others will act, that things are not bad enough yet. This delay feels reasonable, but delay is how acceptance is born. Doing nothing after awareness is not laziness. It is a psychological negotiation. You trade freedom for stability. You trade agency for safety. You convince yourself that awareness alone is enough, that seeing is the same as resisting, but awareness without action slowly transforms into resignation. The truth becomes background noise, something you know, but no longer respond to. This is how people learn to live inside contradictions. They know the system limits them, yet they participate. They know the rules are unfair, yet they follow. They know they are managed, yet they comply, because compliance is easier than disruption. This moment is powerful because it does not feel dramatic. There is no collapse, no rebellion, no clear line crossed, just a quiet decision to continue as before. And once that decision is made repeatedly, it becomes character. The realization fades, but the behavior remains. People stop saying, "I am not free," and start saying, "This is just how things are." The loss of freedom is not marked by chains, but by habits. Systems rely on this moment. They do not fear awareness. They fear action. They can survive critique. They cannot survive refusal. So they allow understanding. They tolerate discussion. They even encourage controlled dissent, as long as it leads nowhere, as long as people return to normal, as long as realization ends in inaction. The tragedy of this moment is not ignorance. It is clarity without courage. Not because courage is absent, but because it is postponed indefinitely. And postponed courage slowly turns into compliance. The moment you realize you are not free and do nothing is not a failure of intelligence. It is a surrender disguised as patience. Freedom is not lost when people are unaware. It is lost when people know and continue anyway. Silence feels responsible when speaking is framed as danger rather than necessity. In many systems, people are taught that stability depends on restraint, that raising concerns might cause conflict, panic, or harm. So choosing not to speak is presented as wisdom, maturity, or care. This framing is powerful because it turns inaction into virtue. People convince themselves that staying quiet protects others, that it preserves order, that it avoids making things worse. When silence is moralized, it no longer feels like avoidance. It feels like duty. This sense of responsibility is reinforced socially. Those who speak out are labeled disruptive, emotional, or irresponsible. They are accused of creating problems rather than revealing them. Meanwhile, those who remain silent are praised for being reasonable, calm, and cooperative. This contrast teaches behavior quickly. People learn that silence preserves belonging, while speech risks isolation. Over time, the fear of consequences is replaced by a belief that silence itself is good. When silence feels responsible, accountability dissolves. Harm continues, but no one feels personally responsible because everyone believes they are protecting something larger. People wait for the right moment, the proper channel, the perfect wording. That moment never arrives. Injustice is postponed indefinitely under the language of caution. This mindset reshapes morality. People stop asking whether something is wrong and start asking whether it is appropriate to mention it. Ethics are filtered through politeness and tone. Concern becomes conditional. The system benefits because critique is neutralized before it is expressed. No censorship is required. When silence is experienced as responsibility, systems gain their strongest shield. People who believe they are doing the right thing by doing nothing. And as long as restraint feels virtuous, truth remains unspoken, while harm continues quietly, protected by the belief that speaking would be worse. Silence feels responsible when speaking is framed as danger rather than necessity. In many systems, people are taught that stability depends on restraint, that raising concerns might cause conflict, panic, or harm. So choosing not to speak is presented as wisdom, maturity, or care. This framing is powerful because it turns inaction into virtue. People convince themselves that staying quiet protects others, that it preserves order, that it avoids making things worse. When silence is moralized, it no longer feels like avoidance. It feels like duty. This sense of responsibility is reinforced socially. Those who speak out are labeled disruptive, emotional, or irresponsible. They are accused of creating problems rather than revealing them. Meanwhile, those who remain silent are praised for being reasonable, calm, and cooperative. This contrast teaches behavior quickly. People learn that silence preserves belonging, while speech risks isolation. Over time, the fear of consequences is replaced by a belief that silence itself is good. When silence feels responsible, accountability dissolves. Harm continues, but no one feels personally responsible because everyone believes they are protecting something larger. People wait for the right moment, the proper channel, the perfect wording. That moment never arrives. Injustice is postponed indefinitely under the language of caution. This mindset reshapes morality. People stop asking whether something is wrong and start asking whether it is appropriate to mention it. Ethics are filtered through politeness and tone. Concern becomes conditional. The system benefits because critique is neutralized before it is expressed. No censorship is required. When silence is experienced as responsibility, systems gain their strongest shield. People who believe they are doing the right thing by doing nothing. And as long as restraint feels virtuous, truth remains unspoken, while harm continues quietly, protected by the belief that speaking would be worse. Silence feels responsible when speaking is framed as danger rather than necessity. In many systems, people are taught that stability depends on restraint, that raising concerns might cause conflict, panic, or harm. So choosing not to speak is presented as wisdom, maturity, or care. This framing is powerful because it turns inaction into virtue. People convince themselves that staying quiet protects others, that it preserves order, that it avoids making things worse. When silence is moralized, it no longer feels like avoidance. It feels like duty. This sense of responsibility is reinforced socially. Those who speak out are labeled disruptive, emotional, or irresponsible. They are accused of creating problems rather than revealing them. Meanwhile, those who remain silent are praised for being reasonable, calm, and cooperative. This contrast teaches behavior quickly. People learn that silence preserves belonging, while speech risks isolation. Over time, the fear of consequences is replaced by a belief that silence itself is good. When silence feels responsible, accountability dissolves. Harm continues, but no one feels personally responsible because everyone believes they are protecting something larger. People wait for the right moment, the proper channel, the perfect wording. That moment never arrives. Injustice is postponed indefinitely under the language of caution. This mindset reshapes morality. People stop asking whether something is wrong and start asking whether it is appropriate to mention it. Ethics are filtered through politeness and tone. Concern becomes conditional. The system benefits because critique is neutralized before it is expressed. No censorship is required. When silence is experienced as responsibility, systems gain their strongest shield. People who believe they are doing the right thing by doing nothing, and as long as restraint feels virtuous, truth remains unspoken, while harm continues quietly, protected by the belief that speaking would be worse. Human history is full of artists who tried to make the world more beautiful. George Grosz was not one of them. He did not paint to comfort. He did not paint to inspire hope. He painted to accuse. Grosz looked at his society and saw something rotten beneath the surface of respectability. Politicians speaking about honor while selling death. Generals preaching patriotism while sending others to die. Priests talking about morality while standing next to power. Citizens smiling in cafes while the world collapsed around them. And instead of looking away, he sharpened his pencil. This video is not about style. It is not about technique. It is about why one man chose to turn art into an act of defiance. Grosz lived in a time when people desperately wanted normality. After war, after humiliation, after collapse, society wanted stability at any cost. And that is exactly what frightened him. Because when people want comfort more than truth, they stop asking dangerous questions. Gross understood something most people didn't want to admit, that cruelty does not always arrive screaming. Sometimes it arrives wearing a suit. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it asks to be respected. His drawings are ugly on purpose. Faces are distorted. Bodies are grotesque. Expressions are exaggerated to the point of discomfort. Not because Gross lacked skill, but because he believed a beautiful lie is more dangerous than an ugly truth. He refused to idealize his time. He refused to romanticize suffering, and for that, he was hated, censored, and put on trial. People accused him of being immoral, but what they really feared was that he was accurate. This is what makes Gross unsettling even today. He does not belong safely in the past. His work feels uncomfortably modern because the systems he mocked still exist. The hypocrisy he exposed never disappeared. It simply learned how to speak more politely. This video explores George Gross not as a painter, but as a mirror held up to society. A mirror people tried to smash because they didn't like what they saw. If you are looking for comfort, this is not the right place. If you want heroic stories, noble leaders, or moral simplicity, you will not find them here. But if you are willing to look at power without makeup, at society without excuses, and at art that refuses to flatter its audience, then stay. Because George Gross did not ask the world to change. He showed it exactly what it was. Human history is full of artists who tried to make the world more beautiful. George Gross was not one of them. He did not paint to comfort. He did not paint to inspire hope. He painted to accuse. Gross looked at his society and saw something rotten beneath the surface of respectability. Politicians speaking about honor while selling death. Generals preaching patriotism while sending others to die. Priests talking about morality while standing next to power. Citizens smiling in cafes while the world collapsed around them. And instead of looking away, he sharpened his pencil. This video is not about style. It is not about technique. It is about why one man chose to turn art into an act of defiance. Gross lived in a time when people desperately wanted normality. After war, after humiliation, after collapse, society wanted stability at any cost. And that is exactly what frightened him. Because when people want comfort more than truth, they stop asking dangerous questions. Gross understood something most people didn't want to admit, that cruelty does not always arrive screaming. Sometimes it arrives wearing a suit. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it asks to be respected. His drawings are ugly on purpose. Faces are distorted. Bodies are grotesque. Expressions are exaggerated to the point of discomfort. Not because Gross lacked skill, but because he believed a beautiful lie is more dangerous than an ugly truth. He refused to idealize his time. He refused to romanticize suffering, and for that, he was hated, censored, and put on trial. People accused him of being immoral, but what they really feared was that he was accurate. This is what makes Gross unsettling even today. He does not belong safely in the past. His work feels uncomfortably modern because the systems he mocked still exist. The hypocrisy he exposed never disappeared. It simply learned how to speak more politely. This video explores George Gross not as a painter, but as a mirror held up to society. A mirror people tried to smash because they didn't like what they saw. If you are looking for comfort, this is not the right place. If you want heroic stories, noble leaders, or moral simplicity, you will not find them here. But if you are willing to look at power without makeup, at society without excuses, and at art that refuses to flatter its audience, then stay. Because George Gross did not ask the world to change. He showed it exactly what it was.